Clarissa Tossin is an artist based in LA. She has had solo exhibitions, many solo exhibitions, recently at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver in 2022, La Kunsthalle Mulhouse in France in 21, Moody, a Center for the Arts at Rice University, also 2021, the Harvard Radcliffe Institute at Cambridge in 2019, the Blanton Museum of Art in Austin in 18, and has been featured in many notable group exhibitions, including the Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh in 2020. At the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York in 2018, she was part of a group exhibition, I'm going to say it wrong, but Pacha Lieta Waichasai, Indigenous Space, Modern Architecture, New Art. And it was that exhibition that featured a work that Clarissa and I had the fortune of working on together that was inspired by the Hollyhock House in Barnstable Park, just up the way from here. Tossin is the recipient of a grant of the Graham Foundation grant and the Harvard Radcliffe Institute Fellowship. And to the left of Clarissa is Tohil Fidel Brito Bernal. Welcome, Tohil, who's a multidisciplinary Ixil Mayan creator who is based in the Pachapa, the Cahuilla name of Riverside, California, where he has lived since 2018. He studied archaeology at the University of San Carlos in Guatemala. And here I'm reading his beautiful text that comprises his biography, but I do want to read it in full because it's quite a poetic biography. Centering historical and personal aspects, art is the anchor that connects him to the past and present. Exile has marked his way of seeing time, space, leading him to explore the alternate temporalities of Mayan philosophies. Complex knowledge systems of approximately 2,000 years still in practice. In engraving, sculptures, texts, and performances, exploratory symbolic language, he alludes to fire as a means of communication and as an entity. Collaboration with other artists, he makes use of epigraphy and iconography of the Mesoamerican area to engage in an aesthetic dialogue. Collaboration with other artists has occurred organically to engage in dynamics of creation that foster new nuances in his work. Thank you, Tohil, for being here. And we're also really pleased to be joined by Maria Regina Firmino Castillo. Welcome, Maria, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Dance at the University of Riverside. She's also an artist, a collaborator of Tohil's, and we have the honor of having her translating in Spanish tonight, so thank you for being here. So by way of beginning, I had very much envisioned this being a dialogue between Clarissa and Tohil, given the close collaboration that is needed to realize a work like this. But I thought as a way of starting, because I remember talking to you, Clarissa, during this period that you were in the process of making this work. And I thought that it might be interesting to start with that, because seeing it again also, I can't help as a curator thinking about your earlier works and how it weaves together so many different aspects of your artistic practice, but in a much more ambitious way. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about the making of the film, because it was done over many, many years as well, right? During a period of the pandemic where you had to kind of shift gears as well. Multiple sites, as you can see from the film, many sites that are familiar to some of you here in LA, the Sowden House, many of the really important Mayan Revival-style architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright. So these are strands that have entered into your practice. And I wonder if you can just talk about the making of the film itself and that process.
First of all, thanks everyone who came. This is the toughest crowd because it's a mix of old friends, new friends, colors family, and so many people who make me very nervous. But So this film came out of Ixil Maya, video performance shot at the Hollyhock House, and at the time that I was finishing post-production of that work, I wanted to compose music for Mayan pre-Columbian flutes that are held in museums. And it was a very ambitious idea, but obviously impossible to realize with the time frame that I had and budget. So, but that desire ended up becoming this project. So it started from approaching different institutions, including LACMA and the Fowler Museum here in LA, and trying to request to use some of their Mayan wind instrument holding to be played in the Mayan Revival homes in LA. And of course, that soon I realized that would be impossible. I would be allowed to loan the flutes but not play them. And I thought that that was it, that the project was over. How would I be able to realize this? Because the whole idea for me was to really take these instruments, musical instruments that I kept in museums as dead instruments or just as objects, and bring them alive and connect them to these architectonic structures that have a very complicated history and place in the LA cultural fabric. I was eventually introduced to an archaeologist, anthropologist, Jared Katz, who's been doing this investigation where he 3D scans pre-Columbian flutes and prints them. So all the flutes that you see in the film are replicas of Mayan ancient flutes that are held in different museums in the US and Guatemala. And at the same time that I was doing that, I knew that I wanted to collaborate with contemporary Mayan artists. But that was like a big question for me of who these people, these artists would be, because I wanted to collaborate with artists who I thought that would be doing a work that was in conversation with the kind of questions that I was asking myself while studying and visiting these Mayan Revival houses. So I started going to different festivals and places in LA, trying to connect with Mayan artists, and it took me almost 2 years to get to Tohil Fidel Brito Bernal, who's here with us today. And I was very interested. The first time that we met was 2018, and the project was still being formed. And maybe I'm extending myself too much here because we don't have a lot of time. We will talk more about specific things that made me very interested in the work that Tohil was developing until I invited him to be part of the film. And also poet Rosa Chávez from Guatemala, who you see in the film in several locations in Guatemala. So the project started just from the desire to do that, and little by little I did a residency at 18th Street Art Center in Santa Monica, where I was able to print the 3D flutes for the first time. Using regular 3D printing filament, and it was a total disaster. Half of them did not play, and I thought that 3D printing was this very reliable process, and it turns out that it's not. You get the same file, you print it 3 times, and the sound of the flutes is different, only one of them play, and so on and so forth. So while it took me 2 years almost to get to a place where I had the flutes, which you see in the film. They are printed in ceramics. They were printed in Ukraine in a specific 3D printing facility that works with ceramics in a more traditional way. So they have a completely different acoustic quality than if you just print the regular, plastic filament. And while I was doing that, I started having conversations with Tohil and Rosa. And then the pandemic hit, and I wanted to bring Rosa Chávez to LA and film with her here, and that became impossible. And then it's when the idea of going to Guatemala came to the table. I always wanted to go, but we didn't have a budget to do that. But with the pandemic, it's almost became an excuse of like, I can bring her, so now I really have to figure out how to go there. And at this point, I already had EMPAC as a commissioning institution that really, Vic Brooks, the curator at EMPAC, was instrumental in making this film happen, because it was like 4 years doing this and unsurmountable amount of like problems and pandemic, and she was always behind it and pushing it. So eventually I went to Guatemala, and part of all the Mayan revival, the cement block houses that you see, all of that was filmed during the pandemic in 2022, the Sowden House in 2021. So it was also, we filmed it like maybe throughout 2 or 3 years. Jeremy Glaholt, my GP, is here, you should know that. Yeah, maybe I'll stop.
Yeah. Well, you'll talk more about it, but it's the houses themselves, and you know the extension of the project at the Hollyhock House, which resulted in a film called Ixil Maya, in which Clarissa made kind of a film that's based on a dance performance, collaborating with Crystal Sepulveda, a local choreographer, in which you were using dance and movement to kind of reinscribe Mayan, Mesoamerican kind of iconography back onto the architecture of the Hollyhock House. And it struck me looking at this film, because so much of it is about kind of the breath and the sound and reappropriating, reclaiming those kinds of cultural references through sound, and of course Tohil through script. So I thought that was a really interesting extension of that. But what we haven't talked about is the Mayan theater, which comes in and out of the film, which is just down the street in downtown LA on Broadway, one of the incredible kind of movie palace theaters that line Broadway. And you've done work in that context, but it was incredible that you wove it into this particular film. So I know you'll talk a little bit more about that, but in the interest of time, I want to hand it off to you and to Tohil.
Okay, I want to hear from Tohil after this long process. So when I first visited Tohil's studio in 2018, and I shared the work that I had been doing about Mayan revival architecture. And he was not particularly aware of Mayan revival architecture, as many people are not, or interested in that subject. But now that the film is done, after a long 4-year process of looking at these buildings, finding his own references to what he was seeing, I'm curious to know from you, Tohil, if you could talk more about the experience of being in that space. Also, because we filmed with Tohil at the Sowden House, and we brought objects from his studio and house, and the idea was to make the Sowden House his house, creating this more intimate niche where he would be doing his work that he does in his house, but there. And overlaying some biographical information about Tohil. So from the discussions that we had in the beginning, and then going through the process of filming there, could you share with us the experience of being in that space?
El microphone.
Bueno, estando ahí en el espacio, fue dar un paso a un... Yo nunca imaginé estar ahí en el espacio, ¿no? Pero estando ahí fue como entrar a una frontera, ¿no? Y en lo personal la casa no me fue hostil, sentí la calidez de la casa, ¿no? Es un material que es como cálido, rojizo, entonces como es cálido, ¿no? Fue una entrada cálida. Estando ahí en el espacio, recuerdo que me quité los zapatos y me puse ahí a caminar, ¿no? Y movimos muebles, pusimos, arreglamos, ¿no? Me senté en el suelo para ver los mapas y bueno, ese tipo de exploraciones, ¿no?
So Tohil says that being there in the house was like taking a step. He never imagined being in that kind of space. So it was like crossing a border. Personally, he didn't feel that the house was hostile. The material is warm, it has like a red coloring, the materials that the house is made out of. And being inside, he took off his shoes, he rearranged the furniture, or moved the furniture and occupied the house, sat on the floor, and started to move around the house. Creo que te quedaste, ¿no?
Haciendo la conexión de la primera vez que me presentaste esto, recuerdo que pues te invité a casa y mi madre preparó tamales, entonces fue una cosa como vamos a empezar aquí, ¿no? Porque la comida es importante, ¿no? Bueno, y estando en este espacio, pues conocí a tu equipo. Un equipo cálido, muy profesional, ¿no? Y
so connecting to the first time that we met and you presented this material to me, I invited you to my house. My mother prepared tamales. We shared tamales, and the food is very important. And I met your team, and they were also very warm.
Y bueno, pues todos los sentimientos de estos de hasta cierto punto incredulidad por estar aquí en el espacio, curiosidad por ver lo que estaban haciendo ustedes, ¿no? Y más que todo es esto, ¿no?
Well, all the feelings ranging from incredulity to curiosity about what you were doing. So, yeah, that.
Sí.
Well, maybe I would just mention that I was really interested in some aspects of Tohil work that I found that were created a good friction in a very interesting way with Mayan Revival architecture. So the fact that he studies classical Mayan hieroglyphs as part of his creative artistic practice. So he excavates ancestral knowledge as a foundation for his work, but this knowledge comes with gaps as a result of like historical erasure. And I believe that his work exists in these gaps. It's about filling these gaps. So it seems that your artistic practice recreate or brings to life in the present, tries to make this link between the historical, the ancestral knowledge that is there and what we have today, or what we have access today. And I'm reading my notes and I'm getting lost. So sorry. So this is one among many other reasons why I thought that his work would be very powerful in that context of Mayan revival architecture and the issues of appropriation and recreation in those spaces. So I wonder if you could talk about your process of studying classical Mayan epigraphy, and how you go about creating your own hieroglyphs. Because for me, the interesting thing is where you have to make subjective choices to fill up the gaps, and how you got to the title of the film, Before the Volcanoes Sing, which is a phrase from Rosa Chávez' poem, Dame permiso espíritu del camino, the first poem that opens the film.
Pues una forma que tengo yo así es sí, definitivamente los días del calendario maya, porque todos los días tienen un significado específico, ¿no? Como el de hoy, ¿no? Como los días que estuvimos ahí. Y pues esto me ayuda a ordenarme, a entender un poco también la cultura, ¿no? Porque los calendarios mayas existen en las comunidades como tal, ¿no? Los tohiles, los quiches, los ixiles manejan, los kaqchiqueles manejan sus propios sistemas, y estos son sistemas pues son muy específicos, son profundos, ¿no? Y a mí me ha tomado un tiempo. Yo no soy un especialista, soy tal vez un poco tradicionalista acercándome a estas partes, ¿no? Y bueno, me ha ayudado mucho para entenderme a mí, ¿no? Para acercarme, para tener, digamos, una especie de tranquilidad, una especie de fluidez, ¿no? Sí sé, por ejemplo, que hay esta desconexión, ¿no?
Yes. Well, one form that I work is definitely from the days in the Mayan calendar, and every day has a meaning, like today, like all the days that we were in the Sowden House. And there are many communities which Tohil listed, or not listed, but mentioned in order, Kaqchiquel, Ixil, K'iche. I didn't catch all of them. And these days in the calendar are very special knowledge for these communities. Tohil says that he's not a specialist, he's perhaps more of a traditionalist, but approaching this knowledge gives him tranquility, helps him understand himself, helps him flow, helps him flow in time and space, I guess. Fluir en el tiempo y espacio, no sé. Eso, that was my addition, but because I think I paused because it was too much to translate in once.
Y otro recurso que uso son guías de epigráficas hay muchos investigadores en diferentes continentes, ¿no? Que por décadas han estado trabajando con glifos, y bueno, tiene sus guías, Helm que tunen en la cadena. Uso estos como recursos.
And another resource are epigraphy guides that many researchers have written in different continents. So decades of research in the epigraphy, in the area of epigraphy, and Tohil mentioned some of them. ¿Quiénes son los?
Que tunen en la cadena, que son los que he consultado, ¿no?
Those are the sources that he's consulted.
Mi silabario, el propio que he estado yo.
And Tohil also has crafted his own syllabary that he's compiled from all these sources.
Y mis notas de la escuela del curso de epigrafía del CEMIC.
And also his notes from the epigraphy course at the institution that he just mentioned.
Del CEMIC,
CEMIC.
que es el Centro de Estudios Mayas de Yucatán.
The Yurik Nurasov Center of Mayan Studies in Yucatan.
Y el centro es muy especial.
A center is really special.
Y bueno, gracias al centro yo tengo un archivo.
And thanks to the center, I have an archive that I can consult.
Y bueno, los vacíos de los que hablas, ¿no? De estos vacíos que quedan, pues yo los trato de rellenar o de llenar con colores, usando un simbolismo, ¿no? Acercándome para aproximarme a estos, digamos, vacíos y aprendiendo técnicas nuevas.
And so these gaps that Clarissa mentions, Tohil fills them with colors, with symbolism, and with knowledge, by learning new techniques.
No es todo lo que yo quisiera, o sea, no, solo me aproximo, así exploro.
And that's just an approximation. It's not everything that he would like to actualize, but he's exploring in these gaps.
Y para el título también me aproximé a la sintaxis del idioma quiché.
And for the title, he made an approximation of the syntax of the K'iche language.
Y con eso ya construí base todo esto de la estructura de la oración.
And with that, he constructs the sentence or the phrase's structure.
Y yo te pregunto a ti. Sí. Porque sí, desde que llegaste a esa casa, me hablaste de tu proyecto, ¿no? Yo lo veía un poco, hasta cierto punto, lejano, ¿no? Pero, ¿qué cambió? ¿Qué cambió desde estas fechas hasta tu viaje a Guatemala, hasta lo que hicimos nosotros con el primer conversatorio y después en la casa?
So Tohil says that from when the first time he visited my house, this seemed like a very distant.
Que parecía todavía muy lejano. Sí.
It seemed like a very distant goal. But the question is, from that time and your travel to Guatemala and visit to Sowden House, what has changed in the project?
Well, I'll start by saying that I don't start a project knowing everything that is going to happen, but the opposite is a proposition, and then it happens and changes and it gets formed as it develops. We met at the very beginning, so Tohil really saw everything coming together and was able to be witness of my doubts, and he saw me literally searching for things, and all the scenes that you see in the film were very much created based on my interaction with all the collaborators. In the film you see Tohil Fidel and Rosa Chávez and Alethia, who's the flautist, but there is also, as I mentioned, Jeremy Glaholt, the cinematographer, my DP that I've been collaborating for 8 years, who's here, filmmaker Andrew Van Baal, who went to Guatemala with us, who's here today too, Jeff Schneider, another filmmaker who shot at the Mojo'q house, the anthropologist, Jared Katz, Michelle Agnes Magalhães, a Brazilian composer, right? and each one of us like based in different cities around the world. So there was a lot of conversation, and with Tohil, my first meeting with him, I was very much thinking about finding Mayan flautists in LA who could play the flutes. But then I was much more interested in his work and Rosa's work than the musicians I was meeting, and the work just goes that way. I was fascinated, for example, for a calendar that he had in his studio. It's a Gregorian calendar with the days of the week in English, and he was writing the days of the Mayan calendar in the 3 languages, exactly what he does at the windows of the Sowden House courtyard. So in that, I saw that the first time in 2018, I was like, I love this. I don't know, I just love this. What am I going to do with this? And only later on, when I got access to the Sowden House and I saw those windows, I was like, here, the calendar is here. This film is about collapsing time. There is space for that. And in the same way, going to Guatemala, which was not the initial plan, because I started with no budget, and little by little I was able to add things and develop the project further. As I mentioned, it was a 4-year production. It was like a magical experience where I was able to immerse myself in Mayan culture in a much more profound way than what I could have done here in LA. But I also like to be true to the fact that my first connection with Mayan culture was in this city, LA, and through Mayan Revival architecture that is a total construct. But this is LA, and it is through this tangential way that I got to, or I try to find ways to learn, educate myself about Mayan culture and art, and try to bring that in conversation with these problematic buildings. So a lot changed, everything changed.
Clarissa, can I ask, I'm curious over the long stretch of time that this project developed, and I'm interested in that too, how it developed kind of piecemeal almost, right? Following an interest. But I'm curious about the points in which, of course in the film, they come together, right? Tohil, Rosa, but I'm curious about the conversations that happen kind of between the various collaborators, and how much of that was in play during the making of the film.
Tohil and Rosa know each other from Guatemala, but because of the pandemic, we couldn't film with them together. So with Tohil, I filmed here in LA. With Rosa, I filmed in Guatemala. And with Alethia, who's the flautist and lives in Mexico City, it was upstate New York at EMPAC, so the concert hall where we filmed, and also the studio scenes where there is water, that pool. But there was a series of residencies too at EMPAC, and the first one I was able to bring Michelle Agnes Magalhães, who's the composer, from Paris, and Alethia from Mexico, and Jeremy and I from here, from LA, and we did a series of, the experiment was more focused on the music capabilities of those flutes. Alethia was testing the flutes while I was printing them to get to result, flutes that were playable, but the experiments of playing them only happened in that residency. And it was a very interesting process for me, because Michelle always said that it was not, Michelle is the composer, the process was not so much about composing something and imposing that on the flutes, but figuring out what the flutes could play, and that was the composition. And that's why you see a lot of breathing and speaking into the flutes and using the acoustic capabilities of the flutes by tapping on them. All the sounds that you hear on the film are the flutes, even for the sound design, unless if it's water or something that is incidental to what is happening. Of course, that when it's not Alethia playing the flutes, there is sometimes distortions and other tricks that are done, but it's all the flutes. That's we wanted to be very true to that the sound of the film was coming from those. So that, and then when the pandemic hit, there were 2 flutes that we were only able to print after that residency, and they come from the Denver Art Museum. It's like the big one that we play, like being a mask, and the Jaguar one. And for those, we composed, well, Michelle composed things and we rehearsed via Zoom. So there was a lot of that during the pandemic. But it was, I think, because we had to film we filmed separate, and the film feels very together because in the way it's edited, right? But I never managed to bring the whole team together through this process.
I don't know if Tohil, if you have a question for Clarissa, or not.
Sí, es acerca de, porque hablábamos de la reapropiación, ¿no? del espacio, de la apropiación también como fenómeno, ¿no? Y bueno, mi pregunta era si crees que reapropiarnos del espacio lo logramos así como lo teníamos pensado.
I'm going to translate the question. So in the project, it says there is a lot of discussion about reappropriation of the space and appropriation as a phenomenon. And his question is, do you think that that we achieved the objective of reappropriating the space through the project?
I think we were able to create a space to claim a different narrative for the Sowden House and the Mayan Revival homes, in my opinion. That's one way of doing is it doesn't resolve all the questions that someone might have about the subject. But I think we were able to inhabit those spaces in a different way and through music, poetry, and language, which is very much and translation. So the friction of appropriation and translation and recreation is throughout the film. But I don't know that I started this thinking about being successful, but in my questioning of this, but involving myself with questions and situations that could create more friction with the subject matter of the questions I was asking myself.
I think we should open it up to the audience.
I got to Mayan culture through architecture. I'm Brazilian and I grew up in Brasilia. So architecture has been a foundational theme subject in my work. And I have an extensive body of work on Oscar Niemeyer and the building of Brasilia and those buildings, which I have strong feelings, mixed feelings. I love them, that's home, but it's also a complicated history. And in 2017, Clara commissioned a work for the PST LA Getty initiative that was about connecting histories of Latin America and LA. And I made the jump for the first time, feeling comfortable to start talking about something that I was paying attention here in LA. So I filmed at the Mojo'q house. And for me, it was very easy to make this transition because I was thinking about Frank Lloyd Wright's place in mid-century architecture and discourse in the US and the equivalence with Oscar Niemeyer in Brazil. And I noticed that for the cement block houses and these houses, this period that he had in California, he was very much focusing in looking at Mayan ancient architecture, like temples and so on and so forth. But it's something that is not put forward in the history, the discourse around his oeuvre, because it's Frank Lloyd Wright, you talk from that perspective. So it started from there. But I wanted to make films or interventions that would be very immersive and performatic, because the more I started studying Mayan art, culture, my perception is that it was a very performative, refined, elaborate, static, and I wanted to. That was the way that I found to relate to that.
Cool, thank you.
But it's also, I do think about as you're speaking about your earlier works, and I think it does come from a kind of questioning of the inherited legacies of modernism, actually, right? I mean, in the way that Clarissa's early work, Brasilia by Foot, was about tracing, it was this very simple aerial photograph of the footpaths people take along on the quad areas of a hyper, modern city where everything is prescribed in terms of how you're supposed to move. And I think what your work does is to reinscribe the body, the human, the senses, back to these static forms. And so I think there's a continuity in the things that you're questioning from, Fordlandia to what you're doing here. And I think by calling upon these questions and looking at these like styles that we've inherited, but their reference points are so rich, and I think you're somehow reclaiming those reference points through these gestures of movement or sound or through writing. I think very much part of that practice. Sorry, I went on too long. Do we have time for one more question? Maybe one quick question. Yes, here in the center.
Hi, thank you guys. My question is for Tohil. I was curious what materials you use in your art making, and whether you ever use color, and if there's a significance in the color that you use.
Hace el año pasado aprendí una técnica que usa pigmentos naturales, minerales.
Last year he learned a new technique for him that uses natural pigments.
Es una técnica conocida en la mayoría de continentes, es el bon fresco.
It's a technique, it's known in most continents, it's called
Sí,
albón fresco.
pero también usa la cal como mortero, ¿no? Como para hacer una pasta.
And this technique employs limestone.
Es una mezcla.
It uses limestone to create like a paste.
Y bueno, y con esta pasta, arena, que son elementos muy naturales, ¿no?
It's a paste with sand, with limestone, very natural materials.
Se crea una capa y sobre esta capa se pinta mientras está húmeda.
You create a layer and you paint on this layer while it's still wet or moist.
Entonces encapsula los pigmentos minerales y se quedan una vez que se seca, se quedan ahí.
And the mineral pigments are encapsulated in this paste and they last for a long time.
También uso la vija orellana, el achote,
He also uses bicha orellana or achote
para manchar papeles y
to tinge paper, and achote, it's a seed, it's a red seed, in case folks don't know.
y explorando también con los carbones vegetales o de hueso, ¿no?
And also exploring with vegetable charcoal, made out of bone.
No es todo lo que quisiera, pero es lo que es como, digamos, la última parte, la última fase de lo que estoy haciendo.
It's not everything that he does or he'd like to do, but it's what he's been doing most recently.
Sí.
Thank you very much all for being here tonight. I'm sorry we're out of time, but please, I encourage you to ask them questions as we exit the auditorium. I'm sorry we close at 8 o'clock tonight. But thank you to Clarissa and to